Morning, everyone. My name is Matt Cribble. I'm with Spring ML. I'm an analytics consultant. We'll be going into a SAQL deep dive, so get excited. I'm sure you've all seen this before, the forward-looking statement. Please don't make any purchasing decisions on any features in the future, just on the features that are generally available now. So how many people have used Einstein Analytics or Analytics Studio? Quite a few, hopefully. The rest of you might be bored. Just going to put that out there. So I'll quickly go through what SAQL is. It's the Salesforce Analytics Querying Language. And what does it do? It allows you to input data sets, manipulate them, aggregate them, group them, filter them, and then output a results data set. So whether you know it or not, if you've used Analytics Studio, you've created SAQL. Every lens and dashboard uses SAQL. Einstein just converts those steps into SAQL and then returns them as JSON. So inadvertently, you've done this. So how does it work? This is kind of the process here. You start with an indexed data set. This can be opportunities, accounts, or maybe something custom that you've pulled in from an external data source. You then filter, group it, and project it. So you may just want to know what last month is or last year or a certain stage. You can use that filter, and then you group it. Let's say I want to know it by account ID, and then you project it. That first stream is called a projection. Everything in these first two steps is optimized. So if you're doing things, some heavy lifting, if you're going to do a lot of filtering, you probably want to do it in these first two steps. Then what you get back is some tabular data. At this point, you can project that, or you could go into some post-processing. Post-processing could include ordering. Let's say I want to know who are my largest clients, or I want to know who my smallest clients are, who's not using a product, or who's what do certain tasks look like, or what stage are they in. I can do that in post-processing. And then you get those results back in JSON. So here's a simple SAQL query. I would actually not recommend doing something like this in SAQL. You could do this with clicks. But to just give you an idea, on line 1, we've got that index data set. In this case, we're pulling in orders. Then we're filtering. In this case, we're doing it by last month. So we want to know orders by last month. We're pulling back in the group. We're pulling back the year and the month and the customer ID. Then we're projecting that. This line 4 is the projection. So we want back the date and the customer ID, and then how many orders did they have in that time. Then we're doing some post-processing by ordering them by largest first, and then limiting them to the top 50. So that's a simple SAQL query. Has anybody seen this, used this? A few people? Okay. So there are some times where SAQL makes sense. Like I just said on that last slide, SAQL probably doesn't make sense. You can do that with some clicks. You don't really need to use SAQL to do that. Sorting data sets twice, though, might be a time where you want to use SAQL. Let's say you want to compare this month to date to last month to date. The clicks in Analytics Studio don't really allow you to do that, but we have some ways in SAQL to project those types of measures. Or if you want to join multiple data sets, let's say in my example that I'm going to show, I have orders and I have logins, and I want to know how do those things correlate? Do they correlate? So SAQL is an opportunity for you to take those two things, join them together, and compare them in your lens. And I'll actually show you some ways where you may not have all the dimensions you want in either data set, so you want to create kind of a new data set and project both of those dimensions, those unshared dimensions. Or if you don't have access to data flows, if for some reason you don't have access to actually create a new data flow, or you're doing a one-off report and you want to quickly do some analysis, this is an opportunity to do that without getting into the data flows. So let's see some SQL in action, SAQL in action. So for those of you that have seen this, I'm going to do everything in the editor mode. It's a little easier to just jump into the SAQL and see what's going on. So in this demo, I've got two data sets. I've created them, orders and logins. So here you can see two lenses, two different data sets. That's great, but are these events related? How do I know how they connect? Do they connect? Can one maybe predict the other? So I've created this new lens where I've joined, basically taken those two lenses and laid them on top of each other. So how did I do that? I'll show you by clicking on the editor and then the SAQL editor. Sorry. So this first stream, L, is your logins. I've gone through the same steps as I showed before. I've brought in a data set called logins. I've done some filtering and some grouping, and then I projected out a date and the number of those logins. And then I do the same thing with the orders. I've got my date, and now I've got my number of orders. So what I want to do then is take those two together, I group them. This is that post-processing that's happening. I take those two groups, and I group them on the shared dimension of date, month or year and month. Once I do that, I can recall that date field. I can also recall the measures of orders, which I call sum of monthly orders, and the sum of logins, the sum of monthly logins. And that gives me the result set that I see down here. So that's pretty useful to be able to overlay these two data sets, join them together on that shared dimension. Well, that's great, but what about the current month? I see that I have this kind of divergence that's happening, so maybe I want to look at that. So that's how we can create these visualizations, and I have one for orders last month and logins last month. They're basically the same structure for their query, so I'm just going to focus on predicting logins for last month. So with the green line, I've got last month's data, and then the purple line is your logins. So how did I do this? Let's go into the SAQL. Is everybody following along? Are you just like, you're so hyped right now? Getting into some code? So I'm taking that logins data set, I'm calling it login, so I'm sucking in that data set. Then I'm sorting the data set twice, so I'm splitting it. I'm calling it TM for this month and LM for last month. So I'm using the filter statement, and I'm getting the current month, and then I'm grouping that by the day. I'm taking that day dimension, and then I'm taking a login number for this month. Then I'm doing the same thing for last month, except I'm filtering for last month. I'm taking the day dimension, and I'm getting the logins for last month. Then I want to group those two back together. Now, the shared dimension is day. So I've grouped on day. You can see I've also put in right, and I'll get to what that is if you haven't used the different types of groupings. But I've used right. If you're familiar with SQL, you may know what that is already. Then I'm projecting that day, the number of logins for last month and this month. And then I've actually added in another aggregation there, which I'm not going to project, but it's just a way to show you can do as many aggregations as you want in this step as long as you're using measures and dimensions that you've called before. So then I get this result set, which I can then use to create my lenses. So like I said, I've got this right here in here for the grouping. What does that do? Well, if you look down at my data set, or my results set, I've got it to the 18th, but I wanted to make sure I projected out the rest of the month. So I used right to keep all the dates that I had from last month. So keep all the days that I had from last month. I just don't have any measures within that time. So that's what allows me to create that line. Now this ends on the 18th because that was my birthday. So happy birthday to me, belatedly. But that's how I get those numbers outside of there. If I don't put the right in, it's only going to join on those shared days, that shared dimension. So then when I go down to the 18th, it stops. I don't have that way to project out. So that's really helpful. If you know that you want all the data on one side, you can use right, or you can use left. In this case, I was using right. Or you can use full, so it's a full join. You're keeping all the data on both sides. On the right half, where's the data actually coming from? We weren't going to have a question and answer section, but I like your chutzpah. So let me click on you. So you're asking on the right side, it's coming from here, from last month. It's taking all the dates from last month, so it's able to project after the 18th. If I would do left, then it would take all, yeah. So that's how I get that, where I've created that projection line. So I can see how it tracks against last month. So that's ways you can sort data sets and use shared dimensions to do that. But what happens if you have dimensions that aren't shared? What happens if I have, in these two data sets, I have login country, so where did it originate, but I also have shipped country, so where did it go? How can I project into one data set, into one lens, those dimensions that aren't shared? So in this case, I have it trellis, so login country in the US on one side and on Canada for the other. And now this is I get this question all the time. I get it from coworkers and I get it from customers. People want to be able to do this and they don't exactly know how. So here's how you can use those mismatched dimensions and recall them. So the first data set again is orders. What I'm doing is grouping, this is for the last 3 months, I'm grouping by new account ID, ship to country, and product ID. So I want to know what they shipped as well. I project it, and then I regroup it. I regroup it with my shared dimension first, and then the other dimensions I will want to recall. And then I'm done with that stream. Then I go down and do the same thing with logins. On that last line, line 11, you can see I've grouped again the logins with new account ID first, that's my shared dimension, and then another dimension I may want to recall later. So now when I co-group these two, I'm co-grouping on the shared dimension, I'm co-grouping on new account ID. Now, because I use that group on those other lines, I can recall login country, ship to country, and product ID, but I didn't have to group on them. Why would I do this? Well, if you know anything about SAQL, you know if I take out these lines and try to run this, it's not going to know what those dimensions are because I didn't group on them. You can only project dimensions you group on. So that's why when I add these lines in, I'm able to connect on that shared dimension of new account. Then I can regroup by the login country, the ship to country, and the product ID, the three things I want, and then reproject. And that's how I'm able to take two data sets that don't have shared dimensions, mismatched dimensions, and be able to join those two together. Okay. So I'm going to go over this again. Sorry if you're like, I still don't know what you're talking about. This comes up a lot. So to join data sets with mismatched dimensions, group as your last name stream. So in the case of the queue, which is my orders, group there by my shared dimension first. That's going to be my grain. Then I co-group my two data sets on that shared dimension. So new account ID. Then I recall that dimension using the stream name. So in this case, I had Q, which was order, and I had L, which was login. So then I can just recall those dimensions which were mismatched by just using the letter. And then I regroup if needed and project. I regrouped in this case because I don't really care about the account IDs. It was just a key I could use to match those two data sets together. So here's some helpful tips. If this is your first time using SAQL or you want to start using SAQL, if possible, use the data flow. It's going to be faster. If you're doing case statements, if you're trying to rename dimensions or rename measures, it's going to be faster if you do it in the data flow. And if you're doing aggregations that you're going to use time and time again, if you want to bucket certain dimensions, Do that in the data flow if you can, because that will affect performance. What I always like to do, and you saw this in my presentation, is click then code. So start with a compare table. If you haven't used compare tables, get good with compare tables. They're going to be your friend. When you get to the point that a compare table can't do something, that's when you want to turn it over to SAQL. You want to change maybe the way that you're filtering on a date. And create multiple lenses. You can see that in on my first slide in the demo. Create what you want from those data sets. And then once you have that, then go into the editor and copy paste is your friend. Start copying and pasting those things together. Optimize your query. So anything before that first projection is optimized. If you're doing a lot of filtering and you're going to do that on both of your streams, do that first. So you're not doing that twice, so it's not repetitive, it's not redundant. That will slow your query down as well. SAQL is more efficient before that first projection. Once you get into that tabular data, it's slower. It's not slow, it's just slower. So, and then consider cardinality. If you have a dimension that has low cardinality, use that first as well. Don't try and group on your accounts and you have 50,000 accounts. Group on your products where you have 5 products or 10 products. That will help with your SAQL as well. That will make your queries run faster. So we had one question, and I have 3 minutes. I wasn't supposed to I was told not to do this, but hey, it's Thursday. We all saw Metallica. I got that rock and roll in my blood. So does anybody have any questions? Yeah. Yeah. The line? Yeah, I can show the line real quick. Is everybody familiar with Pages as well? Did you use Pages? Pages is great, right? Yeah. So how I did the line, on the side here, your widget, you can use, on the x-axis, a predictive line. So you're basically just setting where you want that line to be, and then everything past that line is going to be predictive. Yep. So if I just took this off, it's just taking whatever date I've set as today. And because what I did when I created that line, I'm just comparing last month. So I just want to know what happened last month on these days. In the case where maybe you do have heavier traffic on the first of the month versus the last of the month. So you can kind of see that trend if that's something in your business. Yeah. Did you have a question? Yeah, good. Okay. Anybody else? Okay. Well, I'll give you back a minute of your time. So, thank you.